We will now proceed to the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty.
Our top stories. Russia launches a full-scale attack on Ukraine.
It is a full invasion of Ukraine. They are moving towards Kiev. He invaded Ukraine because he wanted less NATO on his borders. What President Putin is getting is more NATO. He's getting exactly the opposite. More NATO military presence in the Eastern Part Alliance and 2 new NATO members.
Welcome to the London Politica podcast. This is where we join industry thought leaders and experts to uncover the nexus of politics, markets, and society. My name is Chawla, and the guest joining me today has a background that perhaps really is the personification of this podcast. He's previously worked as the vice president for Citibank, as the deputy minister for defense in Lithuania, and is now the NATO assistant secretary general for executive management. Joining me from Brussels is Giedrimas Jeglinskas. It's so wonderful to have you on the show.
Manas, great to be here. Thank you.
I really think, we couldn't be having this conversation at a better time because we're just coming off the heels of a big NATO summit in Madrid. And I think that's a great sort of place to start our discussion because these sort of, big international gatherings, to the average Joe, they can often come across as a very dry, formulaic affair with, the big issues resolved very incrementally, sometimes, frankly, not at all. But this year was obviously very different, after Russia set off the largest land war in Europe in decades. And because of that, NATO allies pledged to send more weapons to Ukraine, but it also agreed to send 1,000 more troops to Eastern Europe to add 2 new members, Sweden and Finland, that for the first time characterized China as a strategic challenge. Now, there's a lot going on there that I want to get to, and I want to get to piece by piece. But first, I just love to get, your firsthand bird's eye view of the situation. I mean, I understand you were on the ground in Madrid, helping much of this come to fruition. What was the atmosphere of the conference like, and sort of how was it different from previous years?
Well, thank you for this really good opening question. I think in one word, if I were to describe the overall environment in Madrid at the premises of the summit, is really the unity. And although when we were going into the summit week prior or even several days prior, there was a lot of questions: are we going to make it on certain decisions, and will allies agree on a final sort of a strategic concept draft, or on Finland, Sweden, there was obvious sort of tension there. Is it going to happen? I think once you're on the ground, once those 2-day event has started, yes, there was some still wrangling. I think there's been a really good display by the Secretary General of the leadership in helping manage the Finland, Sweden, Turkey sort of interactions and conversations. And with that, I think when you're in a room, you see the unity is there on display. When we walk out of the room to the public space where the interviews are being done and where the press conferences are being run and the question Q&A going back and forth, you see that the unity is there. And, at the end of the day, when you look back now, has this summit been transformational, historic? Of course, because we love to say that it's historic because we've all been there. So it's all, we love to be in the historic summits. We love to be at these legendary summits. But I think just when we look at the number of things that were achieved and agreed, and as I always say, it's important to note that agreement at NATO is at 30. It's always at a consensus level. So it means all 30 nations agreed on all these things. So yes, we have an accession of Finland, Sweden, a historic event, but it has shown that NATO is growing, that other nations want to become part of us, of our group, of our collective, part of the collective defense alliance. And I think it boosts confidence. I think it strengthens alliance. It strengthens both the Sweden and Finland, but also strengthens the eastern part directly, and overall, I think alliance as a whole. And it's the deal that has been achieved with Turkey and Swedish and Finnish presidents is really historic. I think the strategic concept, which was long in the making, the previous one was from 2010, so 12 years ago. Initially, when we were of course, when we're planning for the summit, I would say over a year ago when the planning has started, I think strategic concept was supposed to be the main sort of attraction of the summit, the main deliverable of the summit. Of course, Russia's violent aggression against Ukraine has changed everything. A lot of other things had to be decided, and I think that's where we succeeded of really pivoting slightly, well, not slightly, quite a bit, but still maintaining that strategic concept is there. And strategic concept is quite a unique document because it's dramatically different from 2010 document by really highlighting that geostrategic competition is here, and we have the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace as it was in 2010. We see a war in the eastern part of just outside the alliance borders. China's rise has been mentioned as a strategic competition is here. Of course, the climate change discussions, many other sort of transnational threats that are rising that demand transnational solutions. So it's it's a big thing. Now, another sort of transformational aspect, of course, is the what do we do about Ukraine? How can we help Ukraine win? And here we, of course, allies have agreed to a comprehensive assistance package, which includes a lot of different things to help on cyber defense, to help on modernizing the equipment, food and water, and many other sort of logistical smaller style of elements that were agreed. Now, again, going back to the main message, I think what's most important is that transatlantic unity is there. The presidents were in one voice, and I think that's really why it's been a historic 2-day summit for the alliance.
Like you said, the addition of these countries is a really big deal, and not least because these sort of Baltic states have had a very long history of neutrality. And there's no doubt that Sweden and Finland can make very real material contributions to NATO. Of course, Finland maintains an army with very substantial reserves, and Sweden has strong air and naval forces, particularly submarine forces. And that's not to mention, their very geostrategic position in the sort of current war in Ukraine. But one might argue that the biggest advantage of their admission to NATO aren't these material things. It's actually more so the political dimension of it, because if Putin was betting on NATO fragmenting as a result of the Russian invasion, he clearly couldn't have been more wrong, because now not only is NATO more cohesive and unified than ever before, its scope is actually much larger. So I do definitely want to ask you, would you say the sort of symbolic value of Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO is of greater significance than its military or sort of practical implications?
Well, I think it's obvious that it's both. It's hard to judge, the symbolism of it. I think it has shown that, and I hope that has shown to President Putin also that, once you commit aggression in Europe, there's a response. This response has been triggered by Putin himself, by Russian aggression. This was not asked for. And of course, the nations like Sweden and Finland, they decided, we need to make sure that, we sort of end that formal neutrality position that was there for many years or decades even. Now, I think in this world, and this is, I think, is a bigger narrative, is that if we are in a geostrategic competition world, and the Russia's war against Ukraine is just one expression of that. There's many other things happening around the world. There's the rise of China. There's other, if we can say democracies versus autocracies, perhaps that's the sort of battle that's looming here. I think in this battle, I would argue that neutrality is no longer an option. Now, can you be neutral in this world? I think some would argue, yes, Sweden and Finland were never part of NATO. But I think from values perspective, they were always part of our values-based community. They're part of European Union. They're strong established democracies with a long track record of great things that make these countries democracies and free and prosperous countries. They were never really neutral, but now, of course, this has shifted. That symbolically, yes, the club of democracies, if we say club of democracy, that we defend our freedom, we preserve peace as alliance has been growing. So it's absolutely symbolically, it's a huge thing. Now, militarily, as you correctly pointed out, I think geostrategic position of these countries is of huge importance. Now, Finland has a border that equals the previous border of all NATO countries to Russia. So it's a huge. I mean, it's an incredible addition from strategic, sort of geostrategic and kind of geopositioning perspective that these countries bring. I mean, Baltic Sea. Well, that's where the Russian Baltic Fleet is. Now the whole Baltic Sea is covered with NATO country member states. So it's I think it's in all respects, from all angles we look at this. This is an incredible strengthening of the alliance, incredible strengthening of our broader community of democracies, and makes us all safer.
Mm. And sort of as part of that, discussion about the broader community of democracies, and you mentioned the sort of dichotomy kind of emerging as a key theme, the distinction between democracies and autocracies. I want to change our focus a little bit and talk about Asia, because at least until the start of this year, that was the biggest theme in all the foreign policy circles in the West. In the UK, it seems like people just couldn't get enough of pondering and theorizing about this sort of post-Brexit Indo-Pacific tilt. In the US, America made clear the importance of Asia by formalizing, the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. So it's only natural that, even NATO, especially given its ever increasing scope, looks to Asia, looks to its partners, like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, might come to mind. And I'm wondering, what do you think NATO can do to sort of tangibly strengthen these partnerships? And perhaps, even more importantly, in the meantime, what lessons can NATO learn from these partners?
I mean, I think this is, again, another absolutely relevant question. I think we see that the world is, although, there's some would argue that there's a deglobalization in play now in certain respects. Yet, on the other hand, we understand there's a lot of these issues, both on security end, but also in economy and commerce and trade, are very multinational. Climate change is just it's a big multinational issue that needs to be solved multinational. Now, speaking of NATO and Asia Pacific partners. Now we have 4 formal partners of NATO in a broader Asia Pacific, and it's South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. I know Australia and New Zealand may not always think of themselves as Asia Pacific, but again, this is that part of the world. Again, looking from our European corner. Now, what we have done, we understand that these are values-based partners. We've had this partnership for a long time. The commitment that all the leaders of NATO 30, the 30 allied leaders, as well as the 4 APAC leaders who actually were at the Madrid summit, agreed to strengthen the relationship. Now, I think we got to start somewhere. It's not about a full-fledged relationship. So there are certain elements like cyber defense, like new technologies, maritime security, climate change, and countering disinformation. All of those areas are covered in the agreement that we need to strengthen this partnership. Now, I think one important thing here to note is that as NATO adapts to the so-called 2030, so we look 2 years ago, we looked 10 years ahead, and we have essentially a vision that came from Secretary General and agreed, of course, by all 30 allies, is that NATO at 2030 needs to be militarily stronger, politically more united, and third, that's a really important global aspect, is to operate or approach things to work with a global approach, meaning that we need to take into account what's happening in the world. Of course, we will always remain a region, of course, it's a big region, it's the Euro-Atlantic area, Canada, US, and essentially whole of Europe. This is what we are, but I think we cannot escape, from what is happening in the world. China's rise, both economic and their military intentions, and their recent sort of, steps in strengthening the military with very little transparency, are concerning. That's why these allies are important. You mentioned Quad. Quad is an important partnership. Now, we don't have a partnership with Quad with NATO, but we do have NATO partnership with other APAC leaders. I think AUKUS deal on a more defense industry side has been, hailed as another, pivot, I would say, to Asia. NATO will, I think we need, the key here is to look at the values aligned partners and continue to build these relationships more and more.
And so, the way NATO addressed that in the summit, like you just mentioned, was labeling China as a strategic challenger. And, following on from what you just said, it's clear that in containing that threat, it can't, simply project the sort of nebulous power from the confines of Brussels. It needs to cooperate with allies in Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And, some might say a big part of that equation is India. In fact, the NATO Secretary General was in New Delhi last year, speaking directly to the need for NATO to cooperate with India on China. But at the same time, there's plenty that NATO and NATO countries and India disagree on, and perhaps the biggest one is its support for NATO on Ukraine, which sort of one might characterize as either lukewarm at best or neutral at worst. And that might be a very charitable characterization of it. But even from an Indian perspective, perhaps a substantial barrier to cooperation with NATO is the status of Pakistan as a partner country. So clearly, there's plenty of thorny issues there. I guess my natural question to you is, how can NATO successfully go about getting India's support in contending with China, the so-called sort of next big challenge, without having to compromise on any of the many other things that they disagree on?
It's a tough question, Manas. And now I think I got to say this: India, of course, is some say it's the biggest democracy, or the biggest democracy in the world, has its own strategic sort of positioning, and it has its own, as you mentioned, there's a relationship with Pakistan. There's a border with China. There's many other probably there's a huge country with a lot of internal sort of. Not I wouldn't say issues, but more interesting challenges that the country has. But it's up to India, I think, to decide where it stands. Now, I think from our perspective, we would have, I would say, I would have personally expected India to be on very clearly on sort of a Ukraine side. But I understand also they need to balance from their strategic perspective what sort of response it would come. Now, I think what's important is for us, whether it's NATO or America, of course, U.S. leadership here is essential. We continue working with India and see what are the sort of intersecting areas that could be interesting to work in. Now, I mentioned this is something that we do with our APAC partners. So it's collaboration on cyber defense, new technologies, and maritime security. A lot of those aspects potentially, I think, could be interesting also to work with India. I think India could benefit, NATO would benefit as well. Again, I think we need to understand as the alliance, although, again, as I said, focused on Euro-Atlantic area, what are the challenges that India is facing, and of course, I think the Quad mechanism. Again, I'm not an expert in that, but the Quad, I think, is demonstrating that India is part of that part of a equation, part of democracies, and I think that's the basis. Start with that very, very basic premise: that are you a democracy? Are you a free country? If yes, that's very. I think at the end of the day, you arrive at a. I hope you arrive at a answer that where you need to stand. Neutrality, again, as I said in a previous question, I think neutrality is no longer an option. For bigger countries, they may arrive there later because you just have a lot more power, a lot more tools to mitigate these various risks. But I think it comes down to leadership and willingness to work together, and which I think I hope this can be done.
Mm-hmm. And so far we've discussed sort of this broadening of NATO scope in a very kind of geographic way. I think in the Madrid summit we also saw this happen in a bit of a thematic way. We saw Spain urging member states to pay more attention to security concerns on NATO's southern flank, such as illegal immigration and violent sort of Islamist movements in the Sahel region, as well as Russia's growing mercenary activity in Africa. And I think it's particularly sort of significant that they bring that up, despite the very natural proclivity to talk only about all things Ukraine, of course. And so, raising these issues attaches, great importance to these sort of distinctly non-military threats, such as, quote unquote, the political use of energy resources and illegal immigration in Africa, is one of the things that I saw in the document.
Yeah.
And so this broadening of scope to include these sort of almost, political objectives, these non-military objectives. How capable do you think NATO is of managing these threats, given that, it's very much been a military alliance that's kind of undergoing its evolution right now?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think first thing to note, I think we have to understand that the whole concept of security, what security means, I think historically, or at least in some of our minds, and as students of international relations and political science, we always think security is a sort of something military, something law enforcement, something with the sort of kinetic power involved in what security means. I think the security concept is changing dramatically, and it's changing by really growing and expanding into areas that were not deemed to be security sensitive before. Obviously, obvious things are like cybersecurity. This is an essential. This is actually a domain that NATO is working. Not just NATO. I mean, different allies, militaries are working. Cyber is now a very important, thing. Disinformation. I think many militaries. I know from my time as a deputy defense minister in Lithuania, where defense disinformation campaigns are essential elements of security. You can really destabilize a society if you swamp it with the disinformation and sort of fake news that are obviously fake, but also could be quite damaging to the societal sort of fabric, and it does create vulnerabilities. It does create insecurity issues, and there's much more. Now we've seen even in Eastern Europe where Belarus was using the refugees, sort of bringing refugees from the Middle East and kind of channeling them into Europe, and really creating these bottlenecks and really doing inhumane human rights abuses, essentially, which creates issues within their society, but also creates issues for broader Europe. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, and you mentioned, what Spain has brought, we call it the 360 approach, that we need to approach threats and through a 360 approach, meaning, yes, there's an eastern flank. Very, very clearly, we have Russia as an aggressor there. We have Belarus that's really aligning with Russia. But in the south, that instability in the south is also causing through migration, through some spread of potentially terrorist activities. It's a significant, positioning that we need to address. Now, your question is, can NATO really be effective in these matters, especially because these are more softer, I would say, softer elements of power? I think, yes, we need to show leadership. We need to increase the support to the partners in terms of capability building, institutional building. And there, I think we're not alone. Of course, there are the UN, there are EU, the European Union as a participant, and with their operations, with their sort of capacity building and institution building elements. So it's again, I think we come back to the same question of that security is such a wide concept now, and that social stability within a small country somewhere out, far away from NATO can actually cause instability in that sort of it can unravel into something much bigger. And that's this is something where we need to be cautious, and we need to be aware, and we need to be monitoring. We need to be somehow supporting them, supporting these countries, so we mitigate those risks at the very beginning of that. So again, it's a very complex issue. It's not as straightforward, and you're right. Whereas a traditionally military alliance, I think we're very good at generating a lot of military forces. This is a more softer component. It requires a different kind of skill set. I think it requires collaboration with other institutions. So, but we have to be everywhere. It's not either or. It's really we have to be there as well. So.
And one of the things that really struck me when you were saying that is sort of the pattern of examples you gave, things like cybersecurity, things like disinformation as sort of new security challenges. I think one of the things that might make them way more complex than the previous issues that we've dealt with is how kind of faceless they are. There's not often one actor, one threat, one entity behind it that you can target and sort of rally sort of the flag behind. And I think that's particularly the case if you sort of involve climate security. The broader definition of security is there's no one sort of entity that needs to be punished. It's very much a sort of public action problem, a sort of a commons problem that needs to be solved together, which necessarily requires looking at both political and military dimensions to security. So very cool. But I want to zoom out a little bit and you obviously have sort of approached your career at NATO from a vast different array of what some might call separate careers. We were just talking before the podcast began about connecting the dots between these, so you've had a career in banking, you've had a career in the Lithuanian Defense Forces, and now at NATO. And I'm particularly keen to sort of hear how those different sort of perhaps past lives have influenced your current role. If at all.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. I love talking about, I love thinking about it, just simply because it's, I think it is important, and I just want to say, I think it's the more diverse careers you have, at least for me, I think the more interesting it is to live those lives and to live those careers and to pursue those careers. Now, it's a very different from somebody, I have, for example, I have classmates from high school who knew from the very beginning they wanted to be doctors, and they are doctors, and they're doing great at there with it. So it's probably different people. It's not for everyone's taste to go around and do different careers. But I think what I was always sort of fascinated and was looking for is really how do I make impact. And also the second, and I want to make impact by doing some great things for the world, for my country first, and then for the organization that I work with. And I think, and you correctly pointed out, so I had a career, broadly speaking, when I look back, at 9-year career, so in the military, through military academy and service in the armed forces. Then I had a 9-year stint in finance or international banking with a business school and Citigroup tenure. And now I'm then I started this 5 years ago or so. It became essentially being into political leadership, with leading organizations. And now I'm in a leadership role at NATO. And all of these areas all of these sort of phases in my life and my career are very important. They bring different understanding of things. But at the end of the day, it's all about that impact. What do you learn? What do you learn in each role? And I think in each role it's very different. But as I look forward into the future, and I think it's important to look into the future for all of us, like how do I connect all those parts? How to mold a role, the next role that I hope can be molded from all these elements that I've done, by using the network, the knowledge, the experiences, and I think one important thing is that it's good to work. I know this, at least it's good to work for established organizations, at least for some time. You understand how these things are run. It's that Citigroup is a 250,000 people enterprise. It's somebody has built this organization. Of course, it took time for them to develop, but when you're part of that, it's you got to appreciate that it's a complex project. This is when you're starting in a small project. You have your own London Political, right? You start very small. It's but I thought that experience in a big organizations gives you flavor of how things work, because this Citigroup is not unlike the government, which is also a large organization, and not unlike NATO as well. It's once you reach 100 people, you suddenly become a bureaucracy. But that's the reality of the day. So it's important to navigate these things. But the military it is about leadership. It is about having a vision, but it's not unlike what we're doing at NATO. We have a very clear vision. And to me, the vision was always, I think, the most important thing is that the mission of NATO is to defend freedom and preserve peace. And to me, it's the most motivating thing that can happen. You can contribute to that. So again, from career-wise, I think, again, I'm not trying to advise anything. I'm just sort of looking back in my career and just sort of thinking about it. And it's like, okay, so it's about gaining those as many different experiences in different geographies potentially. And this is what I've been able to do working in Asia, working in Singapore, Japan, Australia, and US and Europe, it gives good flavor. And, I think it really positions you in this world. I hope it positions me well, because I think its ability to connect the dots. How do you connect public sector with private sector, with NGOs, with finance, with military, with intelligence, with leadership, with investments? So it's at the end of the day, to solve these problems. And you mentioned climate change as a big challenge. It's a transnational challenge, and there's no. Well, now there are probably climate change bachelor degrees and master's degrees in climate change now, but there's no subject like that. It requires a multidisciplinary approach, and I think the more networks, the more ecosystems we create around that with different kind of people, the better we're able to tackle that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more about sort of, we talk so much about in the corporate world about diversity, and often I feel like sometimes, to its detriment, it's sort of limited to diversity that we can see, diversity of race, of gender, of sexual orientation. And those are all very important. But, the diversity of just having different backgrounds and different experiences, often vastly different experiences, can, I think, really inform your work. And it's one of the things that we're trying to do is sort of democratize access to who gets into the political risk space, because historically it's always been, someone who's had a very long career in the army or in intelligence or in government or in something, and can use that kind of as a, retirement career, almost political risk. But I think bringing, fresher, younger perspectives into that, bringing in, people who've worked in anything from, like you said, climate or banking or finance or one of these sort of many other, careers, bring something very unique to the table. And, one of the things I've wanted to ask you, because you've had such a diverse career, and one of the things we've discussed on the podcast many times before, is something first, I interviewed former ambassador Tom Fletcher, and he really spoke about the need for, bringing these sort of different, connecting the dots, but particularly at sort of the international organization, at the intergovernmental summit level. And, there's no doubt that, the worlds of business and tech play increasingly powerful roles and increasingly influential roles in everyday life, in politics. So, he really thinks that we need to have sort of better representation for them, possibly in a more formalized way. And, we've seen sort of the first inklings of that. We've seen, Canada, for instance, now has a official envoy representative to Silicon Valley, for instance. And I'm wondering how, you see that, especially with your background, kind of, playing into NATO. Would you say that business and tech firms deserve better diplomatic representation, such as the one held by NATO? What could that look like in practice? But perhaps more importantly, things like these are, sort of set off alarm bells for lots of average people of, big tech and big government sort of interacting together. How do you assuage those fears? I know that's a lot to unpack, but I'd just love to get your take on that.
Yeah. Again, it's I cannot agree more. I think we need the more. But it comes down to diversity. I think the more diverse we are, the better ideas we can probably generate. And those ideas are in the knowledge-based organizations are essential. This is what we work on. Ideas is what we do. So the more diverse, people you have, the better it is. Now, speaking of kind of different people with different backgrounds, are they well accepted? Should they be more accepted here? Should we have more of them at NATO? Or, and not just talking about NATO, I think UN, EU institutions, the same. They probably will all face similar challenges. And I think, and this is where, at least at NATO, and this is something we're thinking about and we've done very concretely. So NATO just also at the Madrid summit, we officially launched the so-called Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic, so-called DIANA. It's a technology accelerator. Plus, the 22 countries opted in to, as of now, to create and launch the new NATO Innovation Fund, which is a 1 billion euro venture capital fund that will invest in dual technologies across the alliance. And I think I can tell you from the very origins of this NATO Innovation Fund, which by definition assumes collaboration with technology companies because we need to invest with them. We need to collaborate with the finance partners, other investors. Same with Diana, the accelerator. I think it's about really being very business-like and connecting the militaries and the requirement setters at the ministries of defense with technology companies, with innovators across the alliance. And the original idea of this these two institutions was I remember we brought it from Lithuania. We set it up also as a small venture capital fund to use defense money, related to defense capital to invest in technologies. But the idea was, okay, we want to make sure that NATO remains relevant in this world, which is it needs to be able to defend freedom and preserve peace in a most efficient way possible. To do that, we need military superiority. Military superiority is key for that. It's the key element of our power, of our ability to deliver on the mission. Now, military superiority cannot be there just like that if the technology is behind. So we need to invest in technologies that eventually trickle into the military capabilities. So that was the idea behind the NATO Innovation Fund. And I think what we are is we're getting there. But even more so, I think there's a lot more, it's a much bigger, softer side of this initiative is that we actually open up to the world that were unaware before, such as an investment world, the investors, the startups, the technology developers, the even academia who work in these sort of research area. So it's a very, very new for us. But for us also it's about leadership. We show that we put the NATO flag in there, and then we also encourage hopefully creation of other venture funds, other accelerators, it's a €1 billion fund that we have. It's not going to, it can have impact, but it's not going to be a massive impact on capability very soon, because to build the military capability, you need a lot more billions than just 1 billion. But the whole point is leadership showing the lead that we are there. And also, as we set up that Diana Accelerator, which will be partly like a new agency within NATO, we know that we need different kind of people there. We cannot have simply a former ex-military there joining and doing we need both younger and older, but also people with different backgrounds, business background, technology backgrounds, something that we had struggled before, I think, in attracting to the organization. Same with NATO Innovation Fund. I think it's going to be more like a private entity with an arm's length from NATO, but it's going to be run like a private business. And it's it's a different kind of skills. You cannot just have a typical MOD or a Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Foreign Affairs bureaucrat, running these things. It's a collaboration. So we're opening. We're trying to do these things, to be more innovative, to make sure that we're attractive for the younger generation, and attractive for not even the younger generation, but for anybody with a different background. And it's hard. It is hard. It's not easy, because bureaucracies, as they set up, as they kind of become embedded into the rhythm of work that they're in, it's very hard to change. But that's what leadership is all about, and we just we're trying what we can to get there. So it's a long, winding answer to your question. I'm not sure if I answered it, but the short is I agree.
Yeah, no, you certainly did, and also very sort of good, very practical, tangible kind of applications of it. Often I think when I speak to young people, the only thing they are often disillusioned by, if at all, is this perception that whatever sort of big bureaucrats are doing is all words and never sort of really action. It's all SDGs and it's all high-level summits, but it's not actually putting the money where their mouth is. And it seems like sort of NATO's making lots of sort of good steps in that direction. And that's very promising. We've spoken so much today about all sorts of things, scary things, many of them about, Ukraine, about the southern flank, about China as a strategic challenge. So I always like to sort of, end off on a more sort of optimistic note. What makes you optimistic about the future, about, the world at large, not necessarily even just geopolitics?
Well, I think the most optimistic thing is, I view the world that is, I think there's two big trends. There's geostrategic competition, which can be viewed as a negative. There's a climate change. So two big things: climate change, geostrategic competition. I think it's making us more polarized. Yes, it's making us more uncertain. I think what we see now, you're in the UK, with Heathrow Airport debacle, all these things, supply chains breaking. It sounds like everything is breaking, sort of on the verge of breaking. Very fragile world where we live in. But I still think that, as we move forward, there's a lot of optimism when you look at what's happening in the technological space, all these new innovations, new technologies, whether it's in biotech or it's in quantum computing or nuclear fusion. Yes, in Europe, we're quite scared. A lot of people, waiting for the winter. What's going to happen is going to be shortages of heat, of energy. But I think all of that still, I think it empowers us to look for new solutions. And we have new generations of researchers, of people, of students like you and others who come to market, and they have all these new ideas, they think differently. And I think there's, as long as we're able to connect the dots, because, it's, again, I probably said the third time, we need to connect the dots in this conversation, but we connect the dots. If we are aware of what's happening, there'll be a lot of opportunities. There'll be a lot of opportunities to make a difference. And I'm very positive that with technology, with the right people, with the right experiences, we can build new organizations. We can rally people. We can rally even in the polarizing sort of autocracy versus democracy world. There's an opportunity to rally democratic capital and to make it all work for us, to build that trust in our societies that is lacking, that COVID really, I think, has just completely wiped the trust in our societies, and it just really polarized completely the kind of lack of trust. I think there's things that we could do more, and I think I'm optimistic. Technology, people, and ability to connect the dots.
Assistant Secretary General Jeglinskas, an incredibly fascinating discussion, one we're going to keep thinking about, particularly as we think about connecting the dots in the various domains of our life, but also the world, and as the situation in Ukraine evolves the next few weeks. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Manas.
And to find out more about London Politica, visit our website, londonpolitica.com, and follow us on LinkedIn. And that's all for this episode. Stay tuned, and I'll see you next week.